Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the District Recorder Dialogue. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you on this Monday afternoon for a special dialogue. First, a few announcements before we bring in our guest. Today, as you probably saw in an email, the Biden administration just signed the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, and we had two bishops invited to this ceremony. We had Mr. Reginald Jackson from the 6th District, as well as the President of the Council of Bishops, Ann Henning Byfield. We sent an email about that with some photos, as well as some information that you need to know about the Build Back Better Act. Also, we remind you the General Board is coming up next month. We don't have any dialogues before then at this time, so find out more about the General Board on the AME Church website or on our Facebook page. And again, that will be held in Nashville from December 7th to December the 8th. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce one of my friends, an up-and-coming public theologian and activist, not only in the AME Church, but in the United States and around the world, the Reverend Jennifer Bailey. Now, we sent out the email for information, and we'll get into these accolades that she has, but what you need to know is that she is an itinerant elder of the AME Church. She is a mother, she is a daughter, she is an activist, and she is an author. She is also the CEO of Faith Matters Network, and she's been doing this work for a long time. And we're excited for the many accolades she's received, especially most recently the Wesleyan Investive Initiative Award, but also she's a social fellow, and also she was, I think it was either this year or last year, one of the 15 top leaders of religion for the United States from the Center for American Progress. So Jen, welcome. We're honored to have you today and to do this special interview between these two Chicago ladies, although
yes.
Reverend Jen is now in the 13th District at the Tennessee Annual Conference. We have with us Kirtiana Freeland. Kirtiana, thanks for doing this. And you won't see me again today, so I will see you all at the General Conference, at the General Board.
Bye, friend. Thank you so much for that introduction.
Bye. Thank you so much. Wow, you guys, can you believe this is our 64th TCR dialogue? And I'm so excited today to be doing a dialogue with a social justice warrior. You guys know I'm a journalist based in Rio de Janeiro, and much of my work that I write about is centered around social justice. So this is an exciting moment for me. Before I start, obviously, I just want to give a shout out to my home church. I'm a member of Carey Temple AME Church in Chicago, where the Reverend Attorney Sheila Wilson Freeland presides. And guess what? She is my mother. Also want to shout out our Bishop White in the 4th District. So we have this tradition on our TCR dialogues. We literally start every dialogue with the same question, Jen. Jen, tell us about your faith journey. How did you get to where you are now, where you're combining social justice with your faith?
Wow, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, and shout out to the 4th Episcopal District, my home district. What a joy. I actually thought that I might read for you all a little bit about my faith journey. I just wrote a new book called To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. And the beginning of the book is really a love letter to the church mothers of Bethel AME Church in Quincy, Illinois, and Greater Institutional AME Church in Chicago, and Greater Bethel AME Church in Nashville, Tennessee, the 3 AME churches that have really anchored my life and my ministry. And so I just thought I'd read a little bit about this. And you'll hear my baby in the background, who is 14 months old. So part of my faith journey that I'm currently on is stepping into and leaning into my identity as mother in addition to pastor. And it says, I was 7 or 8 years old when Sister Catherine Weldon pulled me aside one Sunday after church and said, "Baby, you gonna preach someday." I do not remember the context for her declaration, but I'm sure it partly was inspired by our pastor, Reverend Pendleton, who was a youth ministry genius. Where some saw Black children as a problem that needed to be solved, he saw us as leaders with unique insights into the nature of God. He empowered us to use our voices and trained us early on the nuances of leading worship services. So maybe I prayed that day or read scripture. Perhaps I'd led the congregation in the weekly recitation of the Decalogue or Apostles' Creed. It could have been the womanish way I directed the younger kids in the choir to stand up straight in their green and white robes as we sang the A and B selections that morning. Whatever it was that caused Sister Weldon's spiritual third eye to open and give witness to something in me I did not see in myself. That is one of the greatest gifts of community, the recognition that we do not emerge from our mother's womb fully formed, but rather we are shaped by ordinary encounters we have with the people whom we call beloved. And so I start with that reading because when I think about my faith journey, so much of it was defined for me in the hallways, in the fellowship halls, in the church kitchens by church mothers and women in the AME Church who showed me a type of theological and creative imagination that took, a box of spaghetti and dinner rolls and fed the multitude, made the miracle of the 5,000 real for me, the miracle of the loaves and fishes. And as I think about my journey now, I just turned 34 years old. So much of my journey has been aligned with remembering and going back and recovering what those church mothers taught me, what they taught me about ingenuity, creativity, about strength, but they taught me about justice and fighting for what you believe in. And so I would be remiss if I didn't name them and call into the room people like Sister Catherine Weldon and Sister Jackie Watson and Sister Janetta Green and Gertrude Mallory and all of these women in my childhood who really helped me dream about a God that was big enough to hold my questions, a God that was creative enough to see me in leadership, a God that was for and on the side of those who are marginalized and oppressed. I learned about liberation theology first, not from a textbook, which I later read in seminary, but through the lived witness of those proud and powerful AME women. And so the journey to ministry was, for me, one that started relatively early with people seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself. And I'll be honest with you, I ran from it. I don't know if I'll fully trust folks who don't have questions when called because it's such a deep responsibility. But I have felt honored at every step of the way, the opportunity to serve, first as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and second, in my call as clergy now in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the church that raised me, the church that formed me, the church of Jorina Lee, the church of Rosa Parks, the church of powerful women who centered equity and justice in their view of faith. And so I see myself as part of a continuing legacy that I've been handed and I'm going to be honored to pass on, of AME women who are on the front lines for social change.
Thank you so much for that wonderful passage. This gets me thinking, and I think the audience would love to know more about what are you doing right now that constitutes social justice work?
Sure. So one of the great gifts of my life right now is that one of the primary sites of my ministry is my work as founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network. We are an organization that works with faith leaders, community organizers, and activists to help them think about what spiritual sustainability, what it takes for us to stay in the work of social change long term. Because we know so often those who are called to the front lines of ministry, of justice work, burn out when they're young. They give and give and give and aren't poured back into. And, for me, so much of that notion of needing spaces for us to rest and renew and recharge as part of the work of justice feels like an important intervention, lest we die on the mantle of the social justice causes that we care about. And at the same time, it's always a balance in our work at Faith Matters Network between that which is dramatically urgent, whether we're talking about ongoing struggles around violence or racial justice issues that continue to pop up, police brutality, whether we're talking about climate change, things that seem very, very urgent in this moment, because we are reaching these turning points that we don't know if we don't act now. I mean, my baby's 14 months old. I don't know the world we're going to give down to him if we don't take some concrete action now. And at the same time, I'm grateful that I'm a part of a faith and a tradition that has a long view of time, that I know, in the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. And so even as we attempt to address these very urgent things, taking the time to take a breath, to step back, to reflect, to pause, to renew ourselves, to allow the fields to be, fallow for a while, to allow that creativity and those juices to flow. Shout out to the groups like the NAP Ministry that are encouraging us to rest in the midst of our. It feels important that both of those things are deeply connected to me, that I've seen one too many friends who've tried to die on the altar of justice work. And I want their lives to matter, not just for the cause, but because they are worthy of care.
And how does being from Chicago influence your work?
Again, shout outs to the 4th Episcopal District. I was raised between Quincy, Illinois, which is downstate, closer to St. Louis, and then moved to Chicago for high school in 2001. And my entire extended family is from the South Side. So shout outs to the South Side and Greater Institutional AME Church, my home church in Chicago. I think there is such a powerful Black radical tradition in Chicago of activism and faith-inspired activism. When we think about just the depth and breadth of community organizing as a sort of vocation emerged in the streets of Chicago, right? Faith-based community organizing started in Chicago. And it's because I'm convinced that there is just something about the energy, the ingenuity and the creativity. I mean, I'm proud of where I'm from, but there's something specific about Chicago that speaks into a vision of a modern world not yet to come, right? So that there's all this energy in the city of people who know there's something more that we could be and who have a history of fighting for it. And so I am a product of who I am. I'm a product of, my grandmother, Vera, who moved to the South Side from Hughes, Arkansas, as part of that wave from the Great Migration North that brought with them the ingenuity, the creativity of Southern wisdom and folk wisdom and resistance, and planted it on the South Side, on the West Side, as a way of fighting structural injustice, because the same injustices that were present, the same structural racism that was present in the South showed up in different forms. And I write about this in the book. In the South Side of Chicago and the West Side of Chicago, just because we weren't bound to the land as sharecroppers doesn't mean, right, that we weren't resisting through redlining and other structural policies justice. And we organized and we fought back against it. So I'm shy till I die. I'll never be too far from Chicago.
Yay! And of course, we always have to come back to the AME Church. Yeah. So I have to ask you, how does the AME Church fit in with your social justice work?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that has been true for me as a millennial who is in community with both millennials and Gen Zers is that we know there are trends of younger folks leaving institutional religion, leaving the church, or at least leaving particular types of church, right? Because they find it to be not responsive to the urgent needs and issues that are most pressing for themselves or their lives, not willing to go there around the controversial issues, right? The issues that we don't want to talk about or whisper about because we don't go there, around gender, around sexuality. I could go on. But one of the things that has been important to me about being grounded and rooted in the AME Church is knowing that I come from a church tradition that is deep, right? It's deeply rooted in social justice, that we started as a social justice movement, a movement against racial injustice. And I'll say today that one of the most powerful parts of my ministry is that my church is one of the few spaces in my life here in Nashville, Tennessee, Greater Bethel AME Church, that I have intergenerational relationships. And I am deeply convinced that if we're going to confront the pressing challenges that we see, the crisis in our democracy, continued structural emboldened white supremacy, right? We're going to need the creativity, the ingenuity and genius of all of us across generations to confront these issues. And so one of the unique gifts of the AME Church specifically is that it is a space that brings together people across generations in a world where we are more segregated by age than ever before.
I love that you brought up that going to church gives you access to people that perhaps you don't have access to in your everyday life. And I found that to be similar in my own life. I've been to churches where there was a significant difference between the social class. And, it was, I thought it was, I belonged to a church in which it was my only outlet to interact with, a social class who didn't have as much money, many opportunities as me. And I really valued that interaction because it just made my life much more fuller. In addition to just, obviously being able to interact with multiple generations of women. So that's one thing you can always count on in the AME Church. Lots of generations of women.
Yes.
So moving forward, you've navigated a path as an ordained clergywoman, not in the pastorate. You are an itinerant elder. So what advice do you have for people who are called to ministry, but not necessarily called to pastor?
Yeah, well, I first want to honor all the folks in the Chicago Annual Conference and my Board of Ministerial Training, who I was real transparent with from the beginning that it didn't feel like God was calling me to pastor necessarily, but was calling me to really embrace our Methodist heritage, that the world was our pulpit, that I was meant to be pastoring that which was emerging in this time. And so I don't think that would have been possible, that my ordination wouldn't have been possible without the support of people who saw creative visions for ministry. And I'll also say that, I might not be in the pastorate, but I am so grateful for the opportunity to serve at a local church, that there is something about being grounded in a local context, being able to be a part of worship, being able to deliver the sacraments and be on prayer line every Monday and go to Bible study, that is deeply rooting for me in a world where that will tear you asunder and divide your attention. And so even though I haven't been called to the pastorate, and that the primary side of my ministry is this work with activists and organizers through Faith Matters Network, there's still, for me, this sitting on the edge of both being rooted in the church, but also seeing an expansive vision for the ministry outside of the church as well. So my advice is follow your heart. Don't let anybody cast you in their own image. If God called you, God knows how God called you and for what purpose.
And with that, we're going to take our first break.
Has a personal touch that they add to the theological education. It's not that we just get you there and educate you and send you on your way.
It has really developed me in my expanding of my mind, my thinking process, my thought process. It really helped me to grow in how I debate, how I view things.
Tearing up about it now because it was a journey. It was very hard. But having those professors and those mentors and that family experience believing you, to journey with you and to know that they believe in you, I don't think you can get that somewhere else.
Welcome back. Welcome back to our TCR dialogue with Pastor Bailey, Pastor Jen Bailey. So continuing on our conversation on social justice work and just being a member of intergenerational churches, I would love to, let's talk about how your activism has been honored recently. You have been recognized by so many organizations, by Ashoka, Aspen Ideas, Wesleyan Investive Award. I'm so impressed. What do these awards mean to you? What place do they have in your life and your work?
Yeah. First of all, I'm just deeply humbled. And I view those awards as representative of not just me, but of the community that I help lead. So when when I got the award from the Wesleyan Investive, for example, which helps support innovators in the Methodist faith traditions, I knew that it wasn't. First, I was uncomfortable. I was like, "Really, me? You want to give it to me?" But I knew that it wasn't just about me, but about a collective of folks who have deeply been seeding this work for a long time. Community that I'm a part of at Faith Matters Network. On a very practical level, it helped me. These awards have helped pay my staff my timesheets and paychecks and health insurance, right? Like, let's be real. I mean, I think one of the courses I wish that I had required of me in seminary was like nonprofit management, because very practically we take classes in seminary around theology and ethics and Bible, but anybody who's called to ministry is called to run their own sort of social enterprise, whether that be a church or that be out in the world. And so very practically, I'm so grateful for the awards. I'm grateful for folks seeing my work and seeing the work of Faith Matters Network and others as important and worthy of being honored. But more importantly, I'm just glad I can pay my staff's paychecks. That these awards
that is very important.
To be able to offer things like full health insurance for the first time at a time when we know that we're sick, and that diseases like COVID disproportionately as a social justice issue impact communities of color and Black communities. So being able to provide for and care for the people who are connected to the organization in itself feels like a social justice ministry, because so often I think in social justice work, people can extend and expend themselves. And if we're not careful, we can replicate with one another some of the very patterns of harm and discarding that we experience out there in the world. And so gratitude for those awards, gratitude for the ability to pay people's paychecks, gratitude for folks investing in and seeing emerging ministries as a valid site of ministry alongside more traditional forms of ministry as well.
Nice. I love that you brought up emerging ministries. Can you define that for us? Like, how do you define your emerging ministries in the most simplest terms, practical terms?
Sure. In my book, I talk about 3 questions that were asked of me of a friend at a retreat for activists of color, spiritual activists of color several years ago. And the 3 questions that my friend Reiku asked the group were, what is dying, what wants to emerge, and what is already blooming beautifully in the world when it comes to thinking about our lives and vocations. And what I realized really quickly is that those 3 questions, they're always happening at the same time. So there are things that are dying, there are things that want to emerge, and there are things that are already blooming beautifully. And I think a lot of energy and time in the church is spent on that which is dying, right? So we spend a whole lot of time thinking about trying to hold on to old structures and ways of being that that no longer serve us or are no longer functional in the way that they used to be. And I honor that. And having spent a lot of time with people who were dying, I was with my mom when she was on hospice and walked with her as probably one of the more important sites of ministry in my life. What I know is that there is a way to honor and invest in that which has come and that which and help things live and die well. It's okay to die well. And so emergence for me in defining emergent ministries is paying attention to that which is on the edge, that which is beginning to pop up and respond to a spiritual need. So it's things like at Faith Matters Network, we are one of the organizations that are helping define a new vocation, that of the movement chaplain. So in the same way that hospitals have chaplains and the military has chaplains, there are now young people who see as a core vocational identity for themselves serving social movements and social justice spaces as chaplains, as providing care for them, as a site of ministry for them. I think about some of my friends who are seeding and planting new churches that meet not on Sunday morning at 11 a.m. promptly, but meet on Wednesday nights in bars, right? As a way of meeting people where they're at, right? So when I talk about that which wants to emerge, it's really paying attention to that which is on the edge, standing and coming up over the horizon that is speaking to the particular needs of a people. And the last thing I'll say is this, in the Christian tradition, we are rife for reformation every 500 years or so. And so perhaps what this dying moment, which is, again, beautiful. And as Black folks, we know how to mourn. We know how to do a good homegoing service, right? We know how to do it well, really well. And so I say that to say, perhaps one of the things, I talk about this in the book too, that we need in this moment is to compost. And so for folks who aren't familiar with composting, it's basically a term in agriculture or gardening when you take that which is dying and use it to fertilize the soil of that which is coming up and new plants that are coming up. I didn't know that fancy term. I just knew that my grandma Vera, my grandma Harriet used to throw the scraps in a red bucket and use those and mix them every now and then. And then when it was time to actually plant their pole beans and greens and tomatoes every summer, they would actually use that stuff they've been gathering up to fertilize the soil. And so I use that metaphor in the book to talk about there are many things from our tradition, our rituals, our practices, our just way of doing things in the AME Church that even as some things are dying, there are things that might help us nourish that which wants to come forward. And I acknowledge that can be scary for some folks. Change is not easy. Transformation is not easy. That's why we hold it gently and we honor that which has come before. But at the same time, if we don't keep looking towards the horizon, if we don't stay fresh, if we don't pay attention to what the people are saying they need spiritually, then we're going to atrophy, right? Our muscles are just going to break down and they're not going to be of use to anybody. And so when I talk about emergence, what I'm really talking about are those things that are already in the mix, already speaking to the critical material needs of people in the ministry context, and are trying to break forth, trying to come out and speak to those things even more clearly. And like I said, with that third question, bloom beautifully in the world. Oh, I think you're muted. Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear you. I think you might have been muted.
I apologize.
No
Actually
worries.
muted myself.
No worries.
So, in several of your answers to the questions, you've mentioned just how the climate of faith is very different than it was 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And much of your work focuses on this intersection of public life and faith. What do you think about this climate of faith in the United States right now? And actually, if you could extend it perhaps to the rest of the world, I would love to know, since I'm an international person, so I would love to understand how you feel about the faith climate internationally.
Well, I would love to hear from you as you're seated in Brazil, which is so interesting to think about the global South and the experience of faith in the global South being different than what we see happening in the North, in the global North, I guess I want to say, in the United States. Here's what we know statistically from places like Pew and the Public Religion Research Institute. We know that participation in what we might call regular church services has been on the decline for the past 30, 40 years, right? Steadily on the decline, that less and less people are showing up in church on Sunday mornings, for example, and more millennials, Gen Zers are disaffiliating from traditional religious spaces, what they call nuns, right? So people who are spiritual but not religious. I think those statistics only tell a part of the story. First and foremost, they're largely geared towards white denominations, although I see echoes of that even in historically Black denominations in terms of church participation. And I think they speak to a particular type of anxiety about young people's spiritual lives and this fear that young folks are leaving religion altogether. But that's not what I'm finding in my work. In fact, I find young folks, I'm now in my mid 30s, but folks in their 30s and 20s really reaching back to bring spiritual practices that blend together Christian practice with things like altar building, with things like bringing in traditional West African religions as a form of expression of faith and trying to broaden how we think about who God is in the world and challenge some of the ways in which white supremacy is even operative in the way that our faith operates, right? And attempts to police and dictate what is considered respectable or proper, right, when it comes to faith practice. And I think are really blowing my mind and expanding my imagination about who God is and how God is showing up in this moment to speak to the material conditions before us. And when I say material conditions, I mean, people are hungry, people are struggling, people are trying to pay their bills, people are constantly interacting, not just in a hypothetical way, but when we think about things like environmental justice or climate change, disproportionately impacts Black and brown folks, right? That there are very real concerns. And if the church is not speaking to that, if the church is not speaking to people where they are and what their needs are, or if the church is too afraid to be in conversation with people who are asking questions of it or asking questions of God, I don't know about y'all, but if my God isn't big enough to hold my questions, then I don't know if that's a God we're serving. My God is big enough to hold all of it. And so I share that to say, I think we are at a turning point, both in the way that faith is being shaped in the US, and in particular Christian faith is being shaped in the US. And at the same time, I see this desire within folks for faith to speak to the realities of their life in a meaningful way. But I also see, and we could be real, like some of the denominations that are growing most rapidly right now in the global South and in the US South are Pentecostal denominations, charismatic denominations. And I think part of that is about this desire for a sort of freedom and expression of worship and expression of how one engages with the divine, that folks aren't interested in sort of rigid definitions of quote unquote proper religious practice anymore. They're interested both, like I said, in one, a faith that speaks to their questions, concerns, and needs, and questions, concerns, and needs of their community, and a faith that isn't stodgy and isn't trying to dictate how one expresses oneself fully in the spirit, but gives space for a variety of ways of expressing one's relationship with God. And that doesn't mean, again, throwing anything back. I would actually argue that's a return in the AME Church to some of our more Pentecostal expressions. Never forget that Pentecostalism at the turn of the 20th century emerged out of the Methodist movement, right? But it's about returning, I think, always to our roots, examining where we've come from, examining our lineage, and speaking truth into that by leaning into it more fully and living into the expansiveness of God, the expansiveness of the gospel, rather than making the gospel shallow and narrow. Because God will always surprise you. That's what I found in my journey in my life. And we just have to be open to God surprising us in a meaningful way.
Thank you for that wonderful definition. And just to answer your question about what's going on in the global South, much of my work is focused on Afro-Brazilian culture and news, et cetera. And what I've noticed is that in Brazil, that tradition of Christianity and social justice, Black social justice, is not so aligned as it is in the United States. It's actually more aligned with traditional religions that have African origins. But what I'm finding is that, evangelical churches are growing so much, and much of that growth is in Afro-Brazilian people. And there are young Afro-Brazilians who want a way to get involved in social justice work, but the church is just not meeting them at where they're at. They want to express their Blackness and they want to protest, but this is a place where the evangelical church, which is clearly aligned with the far right, just refuses to really connect with them at. So I think that there's an amazing opportunity for your work to come to Brazil. You should do a workshop down here.
Well, I think there's so much in the exchange, right? In the African diaspora, whether we're talking about Brazil or the continent of Africa and the multitude of countries there, the Caribbean, that there is a lot that's being experienced around global Blackness and how it informs the way that we view the world. I count being Black as one of the greatest gifts of my life, right? There's something about the ability to stand and see through the eyes of an experience of Blackness in ways that I just don't think others are privy to, right? Like there's something about our resilience, our genius, our creativity, our ability to survive against the greatest odds, but also center joy and celebration. And if we even think about the Black church as a site of resistance, I think the origins of the Black church tradition were as much in the hush harbors and the secret places during slavery as they were the church, right? That there was something about the tenacious, unrelenting belief that Black folks are worthy and made in the image of God and creative and have their own genius that is just incredibly powerful and stands as counter to the narrative of white supremacist Christianity that would seek to diminish us. And so when I have fear is when I see some Black churches taking on that dominant narrative and forgetting the place of resistance and resilience and creativity that we come from. That is as much an origin about that which was retained by our ancestors in the Middle Passage coming over, as it is about the liberating gospel message of Jesus, who was himself a marginalized person, poor person, and under the gaze of empire, right? So all that is to say is I feel you. I want to come to Brazil. I want there was so much that I think we can learn from one another locally that will help inform our worldview and move us forward.
And now that leads us into our second commercial break. And when we get back, we'll be wrapping it up with our guest here.
Allen University is a small liberal arts institution in Columbia, South Carolina, where we provide small class sizes, dedicated faculty, and a diverse curriculum.
Allen University has provided me with opportunities that will enable me to move confidently toward a fulfilling future.
My time here at Allen University has helped me grow in the field of information technology, and I'm sure it'll help you grow too.
Come to Allen University, where we teach the mind to think, the hands to work, and the heart to love.
Welcome back. Now we have to have you formally introduce your book to us. You've already read us an excerpt, but please tell us about your book, what motivated you to do it, and what do you want readers to take away from your book?
Yeah, well, I have a copy right here. It's called To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. And I think one of the most important parts of the title is that word loss. And so coming out of the experience of walking with my mom after a 14-year battle with breast cancer, in my 20s, losing more than one friend to suicide, having a friend die really recently in his early 30s with health complications, that there's a part of my story that God has put me in a position to learn about loss and death very early in my life and accompany and be proximate to that. And so as the COVID-19 pandemic began to take hold and take shape, and I saw so many people who were struggling with this notion of loss, whether it be a death loss of a loved one, or even more broadly, just the loss of a hope or a dream or expectation because of COVID, it really struck me that perhaps there was something I had to say to those who were living with that loss and didn't know where to place it. And so the book itself is divided into 3 sections that really mirror three parts of our faith, I thought about sort of that narrative of Holy Week, of life, death, and resurrection, and wanted to flip it a little bit. So thought about how would the way we live, change if we started through the lens of death. And so the book is a collection of letters written to a variety of people in my life who I call beloved. It touches on a number of topics, from walking with my mom during her death. So there's a letter called Letter to a Motherless Child, to COVID, the experience of walking with people who've lost people during COVID, to my own experiences of suicidal ideation and mental health issues. Then it pivots, and there are questions and letters that are directed to Generation Z, to thinking about what's hopeful and emergent right now, and that is on the horizon right now. And so the radical hope that is really the theme that ties all the letters together is this notion of hope that's not light or fluffy or aspirational, but rather is a hope grounded in the everyday lived experience of knowing that despite the challenges that we have before us, despite, the obstacles that might be in our way, we have the power within us. We go to scripture, right? Now unto him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above what we can ask, according to the power within us, that we have the power to transform the conditions of the world, as an expression, not just of hope, but as an investment in the future. And that notion of radical hope for me was grounded in the experiences of Black women, of, Black church women, both ordained and not ordained, lay leaders, who for me modeled so beautifully in my childhood what it was. Many of them who had survived the horrors of Jim and Jane Crow, many of them who had survived situations of domestic violence, who had lived, right? And the thing that those church mothers always told me when I was in a place of despair is just keep living. Just keep living, baby. And I think that there is something powerful about grounding in that sense of living, in that sense of hope that is not fluffy, like I said, but is rooted in the lived experience of knowing we can make a difference if we do it together.
Thank you so much. Actually, I just learned that Reverend Rotona Stokes Robinson is watching our broadcast right now, and I just want to give a shout out to her and say that we support her ministry, and we will continue to pray for you and your church. Be strong, and we have your back.
We have your back. Thank you so much for your powerful witness. Talk about social justice issue. Let's talk about gender justice in the church, for modeling and being resilient. And for those of us who are still young in ministry, your model is one that we stick with and have. And so thank you for your courage. Thank you for your tenacity. Thank you for your radical hope. And we got your back. Hit me up. If there's anything you need, I got you.
Yes. So our last question, which I think is the perfect question because it aligns with your work. How do you practice self-care in your life?
Oh, well, I got a 14-month-old at home, so that ain't damn self-care right now. Still new to me, baby. And my first child is radical in and of itself. But I will say, two things come to mind. The first is not being afraid to ask for help, which is a thing that has not come naturally to me. I was trained by strong Black women to be a strong Black woman. And so what I've learned in motherhood thus far is that thriving in motherhood and being the mother that I want to be requires asking for help. So, for example, I'm at my in-laws' house right now when my mother-in-law is watching my baby, because we ask for help. And I think we are so programmed to not do that it can be, it can hold us hostage from getting free. The other thing I'll say is that when I can't get away to get a massage or get away to, especially in COVID times, right, where I would meet up with my friends to grab coffee or just kiki with my girls, right? The thing that has been most grounding for me in those moments has been pausing just to take a deep breath. Even if it's just for a minute or 30 seconds, grounding myself, closing my eyes, and breathing. Because we recognize that there are, in this world, things that would seek to steal your breath, whether we're talking about a disease like COVID-19 that literally attacks the breath, or reflecting on George Floyd and Eric Garner, whose words, "I can't breathe," resonate in my ear, right? So there's something about the power of breath, of breathing, remembering that we are alive, and that that is a revolutionary thing for Black folks, right? That there's so many things that would seek to kill us, that would seek to steal our breath. So just pausing and breathing in, and even saying to myself, I breathe in the goodness of God, I breathe out the negativity of the world, as a way of grounding myself in the quiet moments, which are rare these days with baby, is one way that I practice self-care.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it, and I'm sure our audience enjoyed it as well. Just a quick announcement. The General Board will be held in Nashville from December 7th and 8th. And of course, the Christian Recorder will be there. So please look out for our interviews. And do you have one last thing you want to say, Reverend Jen Bailey?
Oh, I would just say bless y'all. I'm so excited and like honored to be a part of this AME connection. And I would invite us as a church connectionally to continue pushing towards more equity, more justice, for a broader table where more belong, because that is the tradition out of which we emerge. And so gratitude upon gratitude to be present with my church family connectionally tonight, and with all the folks at the Christian Recorder. Thank you all for putting this together tonight.
And of course, we want to remind you to buy her book. Please buy the book. When I get off this live right now, I'm going to buy the book immediately. So I'm looking forward to this.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much.